Hi, everybody. Thank you for joining us today. We will get started here in a couple minutes as we give folks, time to hop on. Thank you for joining us today. I see our numbers going up, so just want to hop back on here and let people know we will be starting in a couple minutes. Gonna let a few more people join. Um, yeah, thank you, everybody.
Yeah, maybe we could probably get started.
Awesome. All right. Thank you, everybody, for joining us today. Um, this is our November Autism Consortium of Texas webinar. We will be hearing from Dr. Sandy Magaña, Jeeyeon Hong, and Larissa Minner. Um, Dr. Sandy Magaña holds the professorship in autism and neurodevelopmental disabilities in the School of Social Work at the University of Texas at Austin and is the director of the Texas Center for Disability Studies. She received her Master of Social Work from California State University, San Bernardino, and her PhD from the Heller Graduate School of Social Policy at Brandeis University. Dr. Magaña completed postdoctoral training at the Weizmann Center, University of Wisconsin-Madison. Her current research
Don't know if it's mine that's unstable or if it's
It froze for me too.
yeah.
My apologies, guys. I lost some internet connection. Um, but we'll do that again. So thank you for coming to the November Autism Consortium of
You
Texas.
don't have to do my bio again. Go ahead and move on to
Okay.
the other ones.
We'll move
Yeah.
on to Jeeyeon. All right. Jeeyeon Hong, LCSW, is a doctoral student at the School of Social Work at the University of Texas at Austin. She has 3 years of clinical experience as a mental health therapist in both the United States and Korea. Her clinical work has included working with children with autism, eating disorders, and behavioral health challenges in community mental health and residential treatment centers. Jeeyeon's research focuses on the implementation and evaluation of solution-focused brief therapy for youth in school settings with a particular attention to depression, anxiety, and suicidal ideation. And Larissa Minner is with us as well. Larissa is an autistic, multi-award winning research associate, trainer, and international keynote speaker at the Texas Center for Disability Studies at UT Austin. She co-leads inclusive research initiatives and a lived experience advisory group for adults with developmental disabilities and their family members. Larissa develops neuroaffirming training materials, including co-developing adapted solution-focused brief practices for professionals who support autistic adults. She served as principal investigator of the award-winning SHAPE in Healthcare Study and holds a national leadership role on AUCD's Council on Leadership and Advocacy. Larissa has trained therapists, educators, and service providers across the US on topics such as autistic burnout, autism, neuroaffirming environments, and disability inclusive practices. Her work bridges lived experience, accessibility, and evidence-informed strategies to enhance more inclusive systems. And with that, I'm going to pass it over to Dr. Magaña to get us started with our webinar.
Are you seeing my,
We are seeing a survey, a Qualtrics survey.
that's interesting. I don't even know that I had that on there. Okay, let me try again.
Yeah.
I guess I shared the wrong screen. Okay, meant to share this one, I guess. Now you're seeing.
We are. Yes,
Okay,
we're
so I'm
seeing
going to
your
make it
slides.
full screen. Can you see the full screen or the?
We can see your full screen. And then lastly, before you get started, I do just want to mention if you have questions throughout the presentation, please feel free to put those in the chat. We will address those at the end.
Great. Yeah, so I'm going to talk about a project that we've been working on. We call it Supportive Outcomes Through Listening, Validation, and Involvement, or SOLVE. And it's really focusing on solution-focused brief therapy for autistic young adults. And go to the next. And so these are just our objectives in terms of what we hope you will get out of the session. Be able to understand a little bit about solution-focused brief therapy, explain how the feedback that we got from autistic young adults, informed this intervention, and kind of summarize the pilot and what we're doing next. So you already heard about some of our research team, and I just want to also add in that Dr. Cynthia Franklin is part of our team, and she's a professor in the School of Social Work and a worldwide expert on solution-focused brief therapy with many different populations. And so she is working with us on this project, which has been really great. Caroline is also a part of this project, and she's been involved in the research side of it in terms of doing interviews with individuals, pre and post interviews. Ryan Wang is a student who's also conducting interviews. Catherine Suture, she works at Longhart Ties here at UT Austin, but she's a graduate of our program and also very familiar with solution-focused brief therapy and working with neurodiverse populations. So she was one of our first therapists for this program. And then Amy Liu is a postdoc fellow who's assisting on the project. So just to give you a little idea of what we're going to talk about, we'll give you some background, methods, and results, and talk about clinician recommendations, because there might be some takeaways for what you can do as a clinician, and adaptations that can be made for young adults. And then we'll talk about our train-the-trainer model that we're currently involved in. So to give you a little background, I think folks probably here know a lot about how there's emerging research on anxiety, stress, and depression among autistic adults, youth and adults. And there are very few mental health interventions that have really been tested for this population. So there's been a lot of work on cognitive behavioral therapy and some other, maybe one or two other therapies, but we really think there needs to be a lot more choices, a lot more options for people. And so we want to make sure we're contributing to that the evidence base on what can be used with this population. And so one of the things that we really feel that solution-focused brief therapy adds to this is being able to build trusting relationships, having people feel listened to, having people feel empowered, and we'll go into more detail about some of those kinds of things and how it plays out in our project. And I'm going to turn it over to Jeeyeon.
Okay, so the main intervention delivered in our study was solution-focused brief therapy, which I'll call SFBT. I'm not sure how many of you have heard about it in your education, but it's a therapy model that was developed in social work field. And as you can see in the photo, these are two happy social work couple who have developed this therapy model, Insu Kimberg and Steve DeShauser. So one thing about this therapy model is it emphasizes collaborative approach. So the provider is not coming from expert, but kind of leading from the behind or listen to the clients and really regarding them as expert on their own. So that's what distinguishes from other therapy, and it emphasizes solution building rather than problem solving. So really working on what already works well and amplifying those things that are working well into other parts of their life to build a solution collaboratively together. So it really emphasizes strength-based approach. So asking a lot about what their strengths are and how we can apply that strength to the situation so they feel more empowered, and is taking client-centered approach and future-oriented as well, as they ask a lot of questions about clients' desired future or what are the best hope for their lives, and trying to really help them to get there by taking concrete actions to get there. Um, the key techniques are miracle questions. So asking about if the miracle happens overnight, what would be the signs that you know that miracle has happened, to get more details of the client's desired future and imagine that more vividly. And also coping questions. So not so much about analyzing the cause of the problem, but asking when the things are difficult, how did you cope with it? So trying to get the signs of or skills that clients are already using to amplify that a little bit more. An exception question is asking about when the problems are less, what are things different, what are you doing differently? And scaling questions are asking about their motivation for the change and how we can move up 1 point higher. So it's really action oriented and positive kind of therapy. So in the next slide, so using SFBT for autism is growing field, and there's some literature we found that preliminary literature that we found that using SFBT for autistic population and using families who has autism or yeah. So there were some literature using SFBT for autism, but most of them are case presentation or case scenario and are very practice-based, but there were no evidence testing the effectiveness of SFBT for autism. And I think we're the first study to actually evaluate the effectiveness of SFBT through this pilot study. In the next slide, so these are two research questions we wanted to answer. So this is our first SFBT for autism population. We wanted to know how feasible and acceptable is this approach for autistic young adults. And we determined feasibility by if autistic young adults can complete 4 sessions, and acceptability was determined by our qualitative interview of how it is received by those population. And our second question was what aspects of SFBT do they find it helpful or challenging in their therapeutic experiences to really inform how we can adapt the interventions or implementation strategies. So for our recruitment, we work with Greenleaf Neurodiversity Center. It's a community center that's working with autistic young adults in Austin area. So in collaboration with them, we were able to recruit 5 participants who were engaged in the solution-focused brief therapy. And our eligibility criteria included young adult population who's 18 to 30-year-old, who has a diagnosis of autism spectrum disorder or ASD by mental health professions, and proficiency in English because our therapist, Catherine, speaks English, and able to communicate verbally because this involves talk therapy and we want to make sure they have the ability to communicate verbally. So this is the visualization of our research design. So we use mixed method research design. And for the quantitative portion, we conducted the pre-test and post-test of the measures. And we delivered 4 weekly SFBT sessions. It was individual and all conducted in person by our therapist, Catherine, in Neurodiversity Center, and they provided the venue. The measure included general life satisfaction, positive affect, and meaning and purpose using promise short form. And in the interview, as like an exit interview, they conducted an in-person interview of their experiences. And that was conducted after finishing all the 4 weekly sessions. So for the qualitative data collection, we conducted semi-structured interview in person, same as in Neurodiversity, Greenleaf Neurodiversity Center. It lasted about 45 to 60 minutes. And we had 2 interviewers present for each interview to make sure we understand and ask questions in a different angle if needed. And thematic analysis was conducted using the software Deduce. And to tell you more about the SFBT intervention that was delivered, it was 4 weekly individual sessions that were conducted in person. And this is a brief outline of the sessions. So from session 1 to 4, and we actually created the manual for working of doing SFBT with this autistic young adult population, and we're currently preparing for it. And each session composed of asking about goals, or if needed, asking miracle questions to really get the more details of the goals, scaling question to ask where they think they are in terms of the goals to gauge their progress, and reflection of break and offer compliments, and also constructing the behavior test to help them move 1 point higher to the scaling or their goals. And at the end, it involved the summary of the sessions and had the conversation about how they can be reminded about the task or involving others that are important to their lives. And our therapist, Catherine, provided the note every week about the summary of the sessions and reminder about the task to help them remember about the sessions. So that was repeated every week. So in terms of intervention strategies, we really try to ask them preferred communication method, and that not only includes communication with the therapist about the scheduling and so forth, but also what they preferred during the therapy session, if they want to write down or draw, or we understand that they have their own method of preferred communication. So we try to incorporate that as much as possible. And also incorporate special interests. So if they're really artistically inclined, therapists try to involve that as much as possible. Or that. And for visualization, therapists use a lot of whiteboards, so putting questions on the whiteboard or agenda of the day in the whiteboard to facilitate that visualization. And along with the lines of visual materials, also the scaling question was adapted into this engine check to visualize the scale and to gauge them where they are in the progress. And that was really helpful for them to have those visualization.
So I will
And,
briefly. Oh,
Yeah.
are
Go
you
ahead.
Larissa.
Okay. I'll briefly describe our sample. So, as Jeeyeon had mentioned, we have a small sample size. We did see a predominance of women, with 4 of the 5 participants identifying as female. The group was also somewhat racially and ethnically diverse, including white and Latino or Latina participants, as well as individuals who selected other or preferred not to say. All participants were born in the US, and their ages ranged from 18 to 29. Some of you might be familiar with PROMUS, but before we look at the results, I do want to briefly explain what each of the measures represents. So PROMOS is a patient-reported outcome measurement information system, and we use the short forms since our study is very strength-based, we wanted to include measures that focused on that. So the life satisfaction reflects a person's overall contentment with their life. Positive affect measures how often someone experiences positive emotions like feeling cheerful or enthusiastic, and it looks at the last week. And the meaning and purpose measure captures the extent to which someone feels their life has direction or personal significance. So with that in mind, this is what we found. This graph shows the pre and post test scores across those three domains. We do see increases in all three areas after participants completed the 4 SFBT sessions. The biggest improvement was with positive affect, where participants, again, reported feeling more frequent positive emotions. The life satisfaction and meaning and purpose also trended upward. However, with a sample of 5, we don't interpret these changes statistically, but they do suggest that participants were experiencing meaningful improvements in their overall well-being, as well as when we look at the qualitative results. So this next table summarizes the pre and post assessment scores for each of those PROMOS short form measures. These scores were collected immediately before the participants began the 4 SFBT sessions and pretty much right after they completed the sessions. So any changes represented here represent short-term shifts in well-being over the course of the intervention. We also included Cohen's D, which gives us an estimate of the size of the change. So larger values indicate a stronger effect, while smaller values suggest more modest shifts across all three. Life satisfaction, positive affect, and meaning and purpose scores increase from pre to post. Again, the largest change was with the positive affect, meaning they did indicate experiencing more frequent positive emotions by the end of the 4 sessions. Looking at the last week, because we only have 5 participants, is it meant to be interpreted as statistically definitive? But it does give us an encouraging early signal that SFBT may help support well-being for autistic young adults, even over a short time frame. Along with the quantitative findings, we also collected qualitative data through interviews to better understand participants' experiences. I will introduce the overall areas we focus on, and then Jeeyeon will go into the detailed findings and participant quotes. Before we get into the qualitative findings, the therapist, as Jeeyeon discussed earlier, asked participants what goals they wanted to work on during the SFBT sessions. This was a collaborative process. From the interview, the post-assessment, we learned that the participants worked on a few key areas. The goals were clustered into areas such as independence and daily living skills, self-identity and autonomy, such as understanding themselves and their strengths, as their social relationships, how to initiate them, maintaining them, or navigate them, and creative activities such as art, which was often connected in their personal interests or self-expression, as well as their mental well-being. And again, these goals were entirely participant driven and guided the focus of each session. Participants told us that they appreciated having a structured space to reflect on their identity and strengths. Some participants said that it helped them put words to strengths they hadn't recognized before. So this is important because research shows that autistic adults' strengths are often overlooked or under-recognized both by others and by themselves. The participants also indicated that they appreciated breaking the goals into smaller steps that were more manageable, and they benefited from the strengths-based tone of the sessions. However, some aspects were challenging. So some of the questions did invite a level of reflection that felt challenging at times, as indicated by the participants, at least a couple. They also, some of them found it challenging to apply new approaches in daily life, that it wasn't always consistent. And for some, there were practical issues like timing or transportation that added additional difficulty. From the interviews, we learned that participants were interested in working on, again, a few key areas um, for improvement in the sessions. And those included more, they thought they could benefit from more sessions. Multiple participants indicated that. They also indicated that there could be more individualized approach, like more incorporating their special interests in the sessions as well. From here, Jeeyeon will take us into the qualitative findings more in depth.
Yes. So as Larissa has said, I'm gonna look at some specific codes that support our themes. So first, in terms of expectation, a lot of them really said that SFBT really exceeded their expectations. And particularly, they appreciated the positivity of SFBT. So as you can see, one participant said they were really expecting to hear more about their negative traits from the therapy, like dealing with depression instead of finding oneself. And they put in a way that SFBT is a constructive criticisms in their language, but not in a bullying way. So they really find it surprised to learn about the positive parts about themselves. In the next slide, again, the theme of strength-based approach emerged again. So two participants said that they really learn more about their strength. I walk away with a session a little bit more confident in my strength and more in my strength than my weaknesses, which is pretty nice. So really recognizing the strength that they owned, but they haven't recognized before. Again, the participant 5 said they're looking at themselves differently, but the good things. Also, the other positive impact they have talk about was they really showed more motivation to practice skills, so they know where they're heading to and just needed to put more work to make more progress was another thing that we're seeing. So one of the participants said that it's like a muscle that I now have, but I need to flex it more often or practice more often. So I've been trying to put them all into practice now. So doing things without prompting. So really showing that motivation to wanting to practice more skills. And they specifically talk about daily living skills that they want to put into more practice. And similarly, participant 3 said, it's just kind of repeating that and kind of strengthening them a bit. So showing that motivation to practice more skills. And as Larissa said, a lot of them showed progress in exploring self-identity. And this was really important. So participant 3 said, it helped me know myself a little bit better and my own strengths and weaknesses and challenges that I face, and not what people are telling me that I can or can't do. And what I remember about this participant is that they said that it was always their parents telling them what the autism was, but never been really given a space to talk about how they felt in their autistic identity. And for them, it was such a powerful questions to think about and reflect on. Similarly, participant one said, so they had the two neurodivergent conditions and they want to do both instead of trying to ignore one or the other. So really embracing that part of self-identity. Oh, and that was also another positive impact was they showed more motivation to pursue changes. So with the same participant of one, so they had both diagnosis of ADD or ADD and autism. So they showed the motivation to just reaching out to different organizations about how they or meeting people or trying to engage with organizations with AUD to learn more about themselves, which was really amazing for them to pursue those changes. And also participants three said wanting to experiment with different things about myself, different styles, as a result of learning more about themselves. And the last thing was there was some cognitive flexibility that was shown, which is amazing. I think as a therapy, I think the goal of therapy is to make people be more flexible and be open to new thoughts. And part of this was shown. So participant one said they sometimes struggle from hopping onto things to things, so wanting to try to avoid it, but now they try not to fight for it, but just switch for something else. So giving the flexibility to not fight for it. And participant three said they feel more comfortable navigating multiple jobs or navigating things. So that really showed us they have grown in that aspect of cognitive flexibility.
Now it's to Larissa.
Based on, so before we ran the pilot study, we did seek feedback from our Texas Center for Disability Studies, a research advisory committee called WIF, Weaving Inclusion Together in Research Hub, which is an advisory group of adults with intellectual and developmental disabilities, including autism, and family members or both. We sought input on the study. We also developed a set of clinician recommendations, especially with Dr. Franklin, Catherine Suture, Jeeyeon, and our research team that could help make SFBT more accessible for autistic young adults. And I'll walk us through that briefly. So the clinicians highlighted several strategies that could help sessions go more smoothly for autistic young adults, which we incorporated. One of the biggest points was giving participants time to process, such as slowing down the pace, allowing silence and not rushing responses. This is also put in the manual as well that we give the therapists. Breaks and check-ins for understandings were also helpful, and repeating or rephrasing questions made conversations feel more accessible. It was also recommended to spend time on participants' interests as applicable, and this did play an important role in building rapport. Clinicians also recommended that certain SFBT questions, such as those numerical or scaling questions that Jeeyeon discussed, sometimes do need to be adapted to be more concrete based on the person's communication style, needs, and preferences. I'll note that these themes lined up closely with what we heard from our WIF advisory group and other lived experience contributors, especially around the recommendations with pacing, processing time, and communication styles. The clinicians also emphasize the importance of keeping sessions flexible to meet each participant's needs. SFBT, as Jeeyeon indicated, is a very individualized approach. That included being open to adjusting certain SFBT elements, especially regarding language and communication, when a more concrete or structured approach was helpful. Other key recommendations were checking in on the sensory environment. Fidget tools were provided at the place with the sessions. Lighting was also adjustable, and there was a white noise machine. And the clinician was able to check in to make sure that the participant felt regulated and that the sessions were comfortable. All of these points were reinforced by feedback from our WIF advisory group, who consistently emphasized the importance of sensory comfort and flexibility in making sessions accessible. Clinicians also recommended building in moments for reflection and recall, which SFBT already has, but being more intentional about it help participants hold on to key ideas and connect what they explored from one session to the next. Offering different response options was also important. It was mentioned earlier that participants were able to communicate in different ways and information was presented visually as needed. For example, there was a whiteboard, at least one participant did drawings, and there was an option to write instead of speak. There were also, for some of the beginning questions on streams, there was also some multiple choice options that could be given. And these choices made it feel more accessible. Again, many participants benefited from having a written session agenda or an outline. That was one of the recommendations, and it could help provide predictability and help reduce cognitive load. These strategies were strongly supported by feedback from the WIF advisory group. They had emphasized also the importance of offering multiple communication formats and recognizing that someone may communicate one way in one session and may vary, so flexibility was important. They also recommended providing structure in ways that felt grounding, and they also felt that having a written agenda would be helpful. Several WIF contributors emphasize that in their lived experience, many autistic adults benefit from clear communication up front about how therapy conversations will work. And this included things like what kinds of questions to expect, how they can respond, and the communication formats that will be available. Many of the recommendations on the slide do come directly from our WIF advisory group, as well as the clinicians. The WIF group consistently emphasized the need for time management support, such as visual timers, clear time cues, and individualized reminder systems, like being told how many minutes are left, if that's their preference, if that's the participant's preference. Clinicians also highlighted the importance of supporting executive functioning needs more broadly. Participants benefited from help with things like time management, personalized apps to manage completion of their goals in between the sessions, task initiation, and as needed, sequencing the goals into smaller steps. We also asked participants how they prefer to remember things. That was also one of the feedback given by the WIF group that is included in our manual and in the training. Some habits, as indicated, like habit stacking and alarms, can help with habit forming. And lastly, there were simple reminders about physical needs such as food or water or medications. So we did take some of that feedback for our next run that we're currently on, that Dr. Magaña will be going into more in depth, as well as from the feedback from the participants in that qualitative portion that was discussed. So we did loosen the exclusion criteria, particularly on the medication. So previously, during our pilot run in 2024, we excluded those that were taking medication for major depressive disorder based on clinician recommendations and the fact that we do have safety measures such as checking for suicidal ideation on screening. We did loosen it to include those that are taking medication for that. We still exclude those taking medication for bipolar disorder, schizophrenia, psychotic, or delusional disorder. We did move to a fully remote model statewide because we included more therapists. This also did incorporate some of the feedback from the WIF group, who indicated that having remote options or remote aspect could help with sensory needs as well as transportation needs. We also added a measure to look at more of the daily living skills. This was because many of the participants did mention in the qualitative portion that they worked on those skills of independence. So we wanted to look at that more closely. during the pre and post assessment. And we did train 6 therapists in the adapted SFBT model. Uh, Now I'll hand it over to Dr. Magaña.
Yeah, thank you, Larissa. Yeah, building on that in terms of what we're doing now, as Larissa said, we're in the process of training 6 new therapists. So what we're kind of testing right now is our ability to train therapists, like how successful we are in training them and using this approach. We ultimately do want to do a larger study, but we feel like we have to be able to build capacity among therapists to do that. And so, as was mentioned, the manual was adapted again after the pilot, adding some of the changes that Larissa highlighted. And to train the therapists, we hosted a 3-day virtual training, was 2 hours each day, and focusing on, in the first 2 sessions, we actually opened up to a broader audience of licensed social workers. And so we had quite a good attendance on those first 2, but the third one was more focused on the strategies in the manual. So that was just including the 6 therapists for that part of it. And so this phase 2, one of the changes we did make is that we will extend the sessions to 6 sessions, because that was one of the things that people in the previous study requested. So they could do 4 if they want to, but they could also go up to 6. And then also that it's including autistic adults across Texas, so not just in the Austin area. It was really nice to be able to use the Greenleaf facility and be able to do the in-person sessions, but we thought it might be important to broaden it out and make it telehealth. And we are including similar measures to what we did. I mean, we are doing a pre and a post test with the participants as well, in addition to we're doing a pre and post with the therapist. So we did a they did a survey, the therapist, before they started the 3-day training, and then they're going to do a follow-up survey. They actually did a follow-up survey after the training, and then after the didactic training, and then after they have seen the clients, they will do another follow-up survey. So that'll give us some information on those 6 therapists. But then we're also doing pre-interviews like we did the first time with the autistic young adults, and then we're doing post interviews with them after they're done completing the therapy sessions. And the goal is to recruit at least 3 different autistic young adults for each therapist. So that could be up to 18 people. So yeah, this is the same thing here that we just talked about. Yeah, just mentioned that. And this is just to go over what we did cover in the training, the 3-day trainings. And then and we do have recordings of day 1 and day 2. So I think those are available on our website or YouTube channel. We'll make sure, if you can't find them, you can let us know. The 3rd day was more, answering direct questions that the 6 therapists had in the process. Yeah, so for this project, I think we already mentioned this, so up to 18. So far, we have enrolled 9 participants, so we're hoping to, over the next few months, enroll the next 9. So it's just kind of a rolling enrollment. As we get a new participant, we do the pre-assessment with them, and then we match them with a therapist. And then the therapists, in addition to the training that they've had, they have monthly consultations with Dr. Franklin, Jeeyeon, and Catherine Suture. So that way they can talk through the cases to make sure they're on the right track, or if they have questions. And they have utilized that consultation quite a bit on specific cases or things they had questions on. So that is part of their training right now. So our next steps are that we're going to analyze all this data, the pre and post for therapists and participants. This will give us a larger sample of participants too, so we can, adding to the 5. And I will say we also added anxiety and depression measures. So we do want to measure those as well, because as we mentioned at the beginning, that autistic adolescents and young adults do experience a lot of anxiety and depression. We're hoping then with the data that we have, that we'll submit a larger grant, with a larger sample, and eventually work up to that randomized controlled trial or some sort of a comparison trial to show effectiveness of this method of using solution-focused brief therapy. But we will, of course, make more adaptations if we need to, based on the data we have as well. So it's always good to adapt things, and we're learning a lot about doing it remotely. Are there downsides to it? Are there upsides to it? There's both. So really learning about that process and how it's working for therapists. So we do feel like this has a lot of implications for practice, and in terms of really promoting disability justice and having a client-centered approach, I think this fits into that very well. Developing collaborative goals is always super important, as was highlighted in terms of the participants' responses. They really valued that, and exploring their self-identities. They also really value that, centering their strengths and breaking things down into small steps. And I think whatever your practice is, those approaches can be used. It doesn't have to be in a therapy session, right? These are great ways. These are great practices for any work you're doing with neurodiverse individuals. And so that's all we have. And as we can open it up for questions, I'm going to stop sharing. And yeah.
All right, I'll come off mute. We do have some questions in our Q&A. As I mentioned, if you have them, just put them in there. So our first one, can you explain how miracle and scaling questions were adapted for the autistic community? Great question.
Really good question.
Yeah, I think I can answer that question. So for miracle questions, so I told you that some of the participants were artistically inclined. So therapists asked them to draw if the miracle was happening, like what would that look like for you, so they can like express themselves in an artistic way and look at the drawings and talk about it together. Or I don't know what the name of the character is, but they can also ask like, oh, if your favorite anime character has a magic power and take you to the miracle situation, what did it look like? So that way it's more incorporating their special interest. So those are 2 ways. And for scaling questions, one of the example was that engine check of visualization of where they're scared they're at. And we also use traffic light metaphors. So it's green, yellow, red. So it's more simplified, and it seems to work for some people because it only has 3 options. And in our recent consultation, some participants said they really resonated with the word base rather than the numbers. So it's really getting to know about your client and what language they prefer and what's working well for them, I would say. Does anyone want to add, Dr. Magaña or Larissa?
I think
to the
that was
question?
great. That was great. And it looks like we have a number of other questions, so we could.
Yeah.
Okay.
So moving on, this one is from Carlos. Could you please clarify if this pilot study using solution-focused brief therapy adapted for autistic young adults includes supports for autistic young adults with learning disabilities?
Yeah, do you want to answer that, Larissa? I'm happy to as well, but.
Okay, I can answer it. So we do have a section on this in our training manual. It is brief, but it does cover I believe, some of the different common neurodivergence, including learning disabilities. But a lot of the strategies, such as offering information in different format, can benefit people that also have learning disabilities. Um,
Yeah.
do you have anything to
Yeah.
add to that?
Yeah, and just to add to that, we in our recruitment criteria, we did not say you had to have a certain IQ level or anything like that. It was more, we did say you had to be able to communicate verbally. So if somebody has a learning disability, and they're able to communicate verbally, they were welcome to be part of the study.
And I'm not sure if it directly answered to this question, but I remember that our therapist, Catherine, also has some kind of a recall questions at the beginning of the sessions. So really asking, what do you remember about the session and kind of filling in the gap. I'm not sure it's directly related to learning disability, but try to
Yeah,
recall their memory and yeah, going from
yeah.
there.
All right, thank you. And then another question, would there be any suggestions on how to apply the feedback from this pilot study from the point of view of a self-advocate? On
Just, do you want to take that one, Larissa?
I can take it. So I'm not. So to clarify, there are different ways that a self-advocate could take these suggestions, and that could include. I don't know if you have like your own future practice or research, or also, or if you're talking about in your own life or with self-advocacy. Many of the suggestions in our study, like taking a strengths-based approach and using like executive function supports, such as like visual timers, as discussed, breaking down information to tasks, that can be implemented in someone's own life, and it can also be used for like self-advocacy. Including community feedback is something that if you are wanting to do research studies or starting your own practice, that can benefit from, because I'm a self-advocate myself, but seeking out community feedback was essential for our study. And that is something that we've done at least twice so far. And I know we will go back to the research advisory committee again to get more feedback. So I would say the takeaway is also listening to like community feedback as well. By community feedback, I mean those that are autistic in this study.
Mhm.
All right, thank you, Larissa. Another question, how can we get added to the list of therapists wanting to be trained?
That's a great question. What we're hoping to do after we complete this pilot, we have 6 therapists, but we need to, and we do pay them. So there is a funding cost to this study, right? So we do have funding from the Moritz Center, I should say. I should mention that. The Moritz Center at UT Austin is providing. And so we reimburse the therapists for their time to participate, because you can imagine the 6 therapists we have, they're actually in practice. They have their own practice that they're doing. So for them to be able to take time out and do this in addition, is important. So we're hoping that after we're done with this, we will apply for another grant and be able to take more therapists possibly. But also, I do hear people talking about they really need this training. So maybe we could develop some sort of a training program anyway that's not part of the study. I think people might like that. So we'll stay tuned. We're gonna work on those things.
All right, thank you. Another question, would there be any ways for Lind advocates that you would suggest to be able to apply the feedback from this pilot study? So maybe in other words, how could self-advocates use this information in this practice?
I
Larissa,
think we answered that.
we
Yeah.
answered that. Um, and then another one, if participants are interested in participating in the study, how do they do this?
Absolutely. In fact, maybe somebody have the QR code handle handy? We could put it in the chat, because we have a QR code that will lead you to the interest form, and you could do that. But you do have to be in Texas in order to participate, because our therapists are only licensed to serve people in Texas. So we're not allowed to include people from other states in this particular project. But for future, maybe we'll do a multi-state thing.
All right. And then another one, thank you for the great presentation. I am wondering what are some of the challenges that you have faced in the pilot and current study?
I can start off and then if you guys want to add in. I do think one of the challenges that we're finding is that oftentimes autistic young adults do reside with their parents and rely on their parents for a lot of support. And we're trying to balance that out because sometimes the parents will come into the therapy session or come into uh or when we're screening, the individual, sometimes the parents will be very involved and we're trying to negotiate that because we really want this to be the person themselves who are, answering the questions and being part of the therapy versus the parents. However, I will say there's nothing wrong with using solution focused therapy on a family basis. It is used widely with families, and so that might be something we think about, or anyone else can try to develop. Is how do you do this with a young adult and their parents? And how would you include that? But our particular study is, since it's only focused on the young adult, we are struggling with how to navigate that. And I don't know if you guys have any other things that have been challenging this time around.
Yeah, I just also want to add that, yeah, solution-focused brief therapy was actually originally developed for family modalities. So yeah, I think it'd be nice to explore about SFBT and families. And yeah,
Mm-hmm.
I agree with Dr. Magaña that sometimes we have to like navigate the balance of wanting to hear the autistic young adult's voice, but also how to incorporate family in a way that is balanced because we don't want to miss their voices. And another part of challenges for the project was recruitment for the ongoing study because we changed it to telehealth model. And because we can't see the people, some people try to put in multiple entries or people outside of United States. So that took a lot of our staff to kind of go through and screen out those cases. We had a lot of quantity of it, but not that are really eligible. So I'm not sure if I'm allowed to say this, but if you know anyone, autistic young adults who might be benefit from the study, yeah, you can send them the QR code and spread it out so they can get the therapy.
Yeah, in fact, Larissa just put the link in there. So
Awesome. Yeah.
so people in the chat. So people who are interested can go to that. Did you have anything else on the challenges, Larissa, in our current project?
Um, I would say like some of the challenges would be that I think it was covered a little bit, but just more like what we might incorporate in future therapy, like therapist training, including more potentially in our training because we did cover communication, but maybe a little bit more in depth on, as mentioned earlier, how therapists can interact with family members as needed, including with the scheduling, as well as like more of like a plain language approach and how to again it was covered in the training in the manual, but uh, there's always room for enhancement for any study.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I want to say, Carlos, you said you're a self-advocate at the Mailman Center, and that's in Miami, I believe. So very exciting to have you here. And I think, and Larissa was a former Lend fellow as well, and as well as Caroline. So we do have a Lend program here. Really glad that you're part of that and asking some great questions. Really good questions. I'm not sure. We still have time to answer some of them, but yeah.
Yes. Yeah, we have another question here. Has there been a focused effort to recruit autistic therapists?
We haven't focused on recruiting autistic therapists, but we haven't also not, ruled it out. So definitely that would be important. Um, And I think, having Larissa being part of the training of the therapist is super important. She's been a really strong voice in the different strategies and things like that. So we do have um, Larissa on our team. She's not one of the therapists, but yeah, definitely should. That would be great to have an autistic therapist.
Yeah, and then what motivated the initiation of this pilot study with autistic adults?
I would say, you know, I think originally, like several years ago, I started talking to Dr. Franklin about it because I was kind of learning about solution-focused brief therapy and looking at the literature, um, showing cognitive behavioral therapy and other therapies being used. But I thought this would be great because it's so, strength-based and it has a much more positive focus. And also the fact that it's focused on not only strengths, but it's not focusing on problems because a lot of autistic people go through their entire life getting behavioral therapies and different things that are focused on what their problems are. And it's kind of, I think people are ready to really focus on their goal, their own goals. What do they want to change versus what do other people want to change about them? And so we just started having that conversation, and then this grant opportunity came up with Moritz Center, and we said, let's just do a pilot. And so that's how we kind of got it together.
Great, thank you. Is there a DOI tied to this already?
What's a DOI?
Great question. Maybe our attendee can clarify.
Do you mean like a publication? Maybe?
That might be. Well,
But
we'll
no, we haven't published this yet. If that's the question.
I think we're trying to publish the manual, so yeah, we'll keep you posted if that ever happens, and
Yeah.
publish
yes,
it out.
publication.
Yeah.
Awesome. What are some unexpected insights or themes that emerge from the participants' feedback?
Yeah, but Larissa or Jeeyeon answer that.
Yeah, I was surprised by everyone wanting more sessions of therapy was kind of unexpected for me. So yeah, that's how we added 2 more sessions to give them more options if they wanted to. So yeah, that was unexpected for me. Do you have any other things that were unexpected?
I think we weren't. I I don't know if it was exactly unexpected, but I think the amount, even though it was a small sample size, of participants who had indicated those independent living skills, where a lot of their goals were focused on that. I think that was unexpected enough that we decided, as mentioned earlier, to actually add a whole measure to check that for the quantitative data. So I think that was a little bit uh, not necessarily surprising, but I think that was something that we weren't fully anticipating on how it would look.
Yeah. I agree with that. That independent living skills, that was something they brought up as goals, and that was important to them. So that was good to know about. I see that somebody was interested in working on a Spanish version, and if you want to send me your email, we'd be happy to talk to you more about that. But I do think it would be good to culturally adapt, this to different populations, because there may be some more tweaks that need to be made from that perspective.
All right, and another question we have here is, what has been the most rewarding aspect of conducting this pilot study for you personally?
Yeah. I could start. For me, it's just been, I think looking at those qualitative results that Jeeyeon presented, I mean, the fact that they really had certain expectations and then their expectations changed and they really valued, the therapy that they received. So it really gives us an idea that we're might be on the right track.
To add on it, as a previous clinician who worked with this population who had autism, I felt that a lot of intervention I was instructed to deliver was very behavior and it was goals set up by other people or parents wanting to do. So it was nice to hear from what they wanted to work on and focus on themselves rather than imposing on them was rewarding for me. Yeah.
As both a self-advocate and a researcher, I would say the most rewarding part for me was that the study very much centers the voices of the autistic young adults and respects their autonomy. Like we take a lot of steps with both the pre-assessment and post-assessments and the therapy sessions to ensure participant autonomy, and that it's very strengths based, and that, as pointed out earlier, is important because a lot of autistic individuals, again, have go their whole life being told what is not I'm saying what is wrong, but that is what society often does. So having this type of intervention that is one, a mental health intervention focused on adults, which is understudied, and two, that is very much strength-based, has been very rewarding.
Yeah, thank you. How did participants express their feelings about the interventions or approaches taken in the study?
I think
Go ahead. Go ahead.
part of that answer has been expressed through the qualitative part of the study. So
Mhm.
I feel that overall they express positive, yeah, things about the therapy and yeah, the things that they have learned. So I feel like they really appreciated that, learning more about their strength and yeah, taking those approaches rather than focusing on problems.
Mhm.
In what ways did participants' backgrounds influence their experiences in the study?
I would say that because we only had a sample of 5, that's a great question that we could ask if we have a larger sample. We can definitely look at correlations between their, different background situations. Yeah.
Would SFBT be a better model than CBT for individuals with autism?
That's a really good research question, actually. And I think first of all, I think we need choices, right? Our autistic young adults need to have some options, and so for them to be able to choose, would they prefer a CBT approach or would they prefer this approach? I think, or other approaches, would be important. But I think it would be nice to do a comparative study where people are randomized into a CBT and a solution focused brief therapy approach and see how it plays out. There might be strengths for each side, right? And things that one type of therapy does better than the other, and vice versa.
Yes, and so that is all of the questions in our Q&A, and there aren't any in the chat. So yeah, I would like to thank everybody for joining us today. I would like to touch on CEUs quickly before you know, we log off. So just to like let people know, if you did request a CEU in your registration, in the coming days, I will reach out to you via email, which will include a link that will take you to a page that you can put in your name and some information that, and the CEU will then generate. And then after you generate it, you can download it, but you'll also get an email from me with the PDF of that CEU attached. And then next week for us it's shortened for the holidays, so just maybe give me 2 weeks to get those done. And then lastly, when you log off, you will be redirected to a feedback survey, and we would greatly appreciate your completion of that feedback. Um, And then I see Larissa, there is another question in the chat about difficulties that autistic adults had with technology during this pilot study. And I do see Larissa is typing a response. So I'll give her a little bit because we do have a little bit of time left on the clock.
So for the first pilot study, I'll be brief. We we were primarily in person, only the screening was virtual. So there wasn't a lot of like technical difficulties, but we did ask during the qualitative portion if there was any challenges. And during our current run, we could potentially find out if there's difficulties since it is completely virtual. And we do ask during our qualitative portion if there are any challenges during the study, including with the interviews and or the therapy sessions.
And I will also say maybe Caroline and Larissa could, and maybe Jeeyeon. I mean, you guys have done interviews with the 9 people online. How has that gone? Like, has there been challenges with that, with the technology?
There have been some. Yeah, there have been some challenges with the technology. And then I would also add to that tech challenges also regarding like communication about the technology and how to join the link and things like that rather than just like getting yourself to a location, showing up and being there. Um, so there have been some, yes.
And I think we were able to address part of it through, even though we're not involving family as a family therapy model, but if they have like parents or someone they can help them log into the Zoom, that was kind of a strategy that was working well for some of the participants.
Yeah, so having a support person, they might need that, a support person to help them log into the Zoom. Yeah, and I think one of the things that we're going to learn from this portion of the study too is how well can therapists develop rapport through telehealth? That it seems like something that we know you can do face to face, but to what extent does this work well with this population through telehealth? Yeah.
Right. Um, What challenges did participants face in the workplace, and how did the job coaching interventions address these?
This wasn't a job coaching intervention, but I imagine that some people might have brought up work issues. Does anybody have any feedback on that?
Gian, you feel free to add to this, but I do recall from the pilot study there was at least 1 to 2 participants that did indicate they worked on goals that were work oriented with tasks. But again, it was not job coaching, but there was something that they wanted to implement, like a task that they needed help remembering to complete, or particularly like self-advocacy that could be addressed.
Mhm.
Yeah, it was not a job coaching intervention, but some of them wanting to better navigate jobs. So really, the therapist took down the breaking down the pieces approach for those and listed by step by step of what they can do or to navigate. And yeah, and for daily living skill, I remember the therapist looking the daily living skills like specific, like print out of those lists. And yeah, just a checking of what they're already doing well and what are the areas they want to work on. So I feel that from this project, we learned that, yeah, maybe having the visuals of the list or looking at the specific actions or might be working well for this population.
Mhm.
Yeah, and with that, um, Sorry, we have a few more questions coming in as well. So we have a question about accessibility challenges in public spaces. And how can these be addressed? Is that something anyone would like to? And I can just say if accessibility challenges was something the participant brought up, that would have been something the therapist covered with them. I don't know if anyone here can specifically speak to those, because I don't remember anything coming up in any post interventions, but Jeeyeon or Larissa, feel free to chime in.
I remember from the first pilot study in the qualitative portion, a lot of them said about transportation was difficult to be in person. So I think that's why we want to provide in the telehealth sessions to reduce those barriers. So I think those are the part that are related to accessibility from my point of view.
Yes, great point. Um, and then what ways did participants enhance their social connections during the study, and what strategies were most effective?
I can answer that. And I don't know if it is most effective, but I remember a couple of participants after the therapy session, after learning more about themselves, like I have ADD and ASD together, so that really motivated them to join. Maybe I can explore more options to, yeah, see if I belong more to this group. And I also remember from another participant also was after therapy that sparked them to join the support group for autism. So really that it was wonderful to see them. They were wanting to be involved in that group and join the group's therapy sessions. So I found that to be, yeah, very effective.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Jeeyeon. Um, yeah, and with that, I will go ahead and end our webinar here. Thank you everybody so much for attending. We look forward to seeing you at next month's. Look out for those emails. Bye-bye.
Ready?
Bye.
Bye.